Elliott Wulff is a native of San Diego, California, and he moved to Tulsa in 2018, where he was an outreach artist with the Tulsa Opera. He taught voice lessons at Tulsa Community College as an adjunct faculty member from 2019 to 2023. His operatic roles have included speaker in Die Zauberflöte.
Yeah, pretty close.
Thank you. This one I didn't ask you. Polyphemus?
Polyphemus, yeah.
Polyphemus in Acis and Galatea. Captain Corcoran in HMS Pinafore. Figaro in La Notte di Figaro. And Gianni Schicchi in the opera of the same name. And Elliott has also appeared with Heartland Opera Theater in Puccini's La Bohème in the roles of Benoit and Alcindoro. He's also been seen throughout Oklahoma as a soloist and recitalist, both as a singer and a pianist. He has a bachelor's of music in vocal performance and a keyboard collaborative arts from Chapman University, and a master's in opera performance from Arizona State University. He is a cantorial student at the Academy for Jewish Religion in California, where he's pursuing his second master's in Jewish music and the accompanying ordination as a cantor. He currently lives in Oklahoma City, where he serves the state's oldest active Jewish congregation, Temple B'nai Israel, a Reformed Jewish congregation founded in 1903. So Elliott will be speaking for around 40 minutes or so, and then we'll be opening it up for discussion. And please join me in welcoming Elliott to OU today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, I was just saying earlier how thrilled I am and how pleased I am to be able to have the opportunity to speak about such a towering figure in the world of classical music, of art music, such as Leonard Bernstein. Let's start with that, the elephant in the room. So is it Bernstein or is it Bernstein? So in the research that I did, the original pronunciation that most people seem to agree was actually Bernstein, which, orally speaking, has more overt Jewish connotations. And in an effort, sort of later in his career, to appear overtly slightly less Jewish, he decided to take after the famous the famous pianist Arthur Rubinstein, and hence it became Bernstein in his professional career. So both of them there's an argument for both, just to start there. So forgive me if I switch between them because sometimes I forget. So let's just start with the basics. So who was Lenny? Obviously, how do you condense the life of a person into, an hour, 40 minutes, especially someone like this? This is the best that I could do. So he was a composer. And within the world of composition, it's not so simple as just saying, oh, I'm a composer, because oftentimes you do kind of end up specializing. So you'll say, okay, I specialize in musical theater. I specialize in art music, classical music. He did both. Not necessarily the rarest thing in the world. There are lots of composers that do both, but he did both particularly well and particularly successfully, to a degree that few other composers have really been able to bridge that gap. So that's sort of one of the first things that, in my opinion, personally, separates him from some of his contemporaries. Additionally, from being a composer, he was a conductor. And pretty self-explanatory, and a marvelous one at that. Many of his recordings, and he recorded a whole ton of eclectic music, everything from Broadway, opera, musical theater, to contemporary pieces. We'll discuss later, for example, he was a conductor for the premiere of Olivier Messiaen's Turangalila Symphony, which is a monumentally huge work that involves electronic instruments, synthesizers, everything. So truly an eclectic musician. To be able to approach that amount of music, that variety of music, and again, have the success that he did, is truly exceptional. similar to composition, most conductors will specialize. They'll specialize in opera conducting. They'll specialize in instrumental conducting. They'll, particular scores that they become specialists in. I'm the expert when it comes to conducting the music of Mozart, the operas of Mozart. Bernstein never allowed himself to be shoehorned into any of those categories. He conducted what he wanted, basically, and he did all of it at an exceptionally high level. There's oftentimes we see people that have these huge bodies of work, and it's like, well, okay, yeah, not everything they did is good, though, right? They have their standouts, and then there's kind of everything else. Not so with figures like Bernstein, which again is, I think, one of the things that makes him a truly exemplary figure in music. Pretty much everything that he did was, if not definitive, at an exceptionally high standard, even in the very demanding world of classical music. In addition, he was a performer, a little bit less known because his performing career sort of didn't come to an end necessarily, but took a back seat to his conducting and his compositional career. And of course, he was also a lifelong educator. Education was a huge passion of Bernstein's. We'll talk later about how he founded a couple academies and the series of young people's concerts that he did, of which I have an excerpt that we'll play. So these sort of four facets are what I'll be focusing on, but of course he was a much more complex person. Just to give you a little fun fact, that he was also an advocate, social advocate. He was anti-Vietnam War, anti-nuclear armament. He was very involved in politics, to the point actually where he had an FBI file because of the potential communist sympathies that he may have held, or some such, McCarthy era and all that good stuff. So yeah, there's even an FBI file on Leonard Bernstein. So anyway. I'd like to start with a piece by Bernstein, conducted by Bernstein, which, in my opinion, is sort of one of the defining works that you can point to and say, this is really exemplary of his style. And I'd like to preface this with just a couple notes. What you'll hear is the overture from Candide, which is an operetta that he wrote, I believe it was 1956, with revisions in the 70s and the 80s. There's like 4 different versions of the thing, but that's neither here nor there. We're gonna start with the overture. You'll notice immediately it's very catchy, it's very fun, it's very accessible. And I say that in the sense that it doesn't sound like some other pieces from this era, where it may be a little bit more all over the place, tonally speaking. He's much more confined, but he brings in some really interesting rhythms. He brings in some really interesting harmonies just on occasion, enough to make it spicy, not enough to make it inaccessible to an audience that may not be entrenched in that world. Certainly, once you develop an ear for that more complicated music, it becomes a little bit more interesting, if not overtly beautiful. Bernstein never fell into that trap. He always brought the intellectual into his music in a way that was satisfying and accessible. So I'm going to stop talking and let him kind of speak for himself. It deserves it. Yeah, it's infectious, isn't it? And I don't know if well, I say I don't know. I'm sure you all noticed him dancing in the middle. That I should say, and I hope this is obvious, that is not normal. And I say that with all the love in my heart. But there is not a conducting school in the country that's going to teach you to stand there and dance to the music. In fact, I would pay good money, and I did pay good money to learn that is not, in fact, what conducting teachers will teach you. I certainly did not learn to do that in my conducting class. In fact, inspired by Bernstein, I came in doing that, and they were like, no. Just stand there. Okay, fine. So anyway, so let's start at the beginning. I'll talk a little bit about his life and sort of frame those facets that I was talking about in their own. And for each one, I have different little musical examples, and I'm going to do my best to keep a close eye on the clock because I'd love to get through everything. Tall order, but we'll see. So early life, he was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1918. His birth name was actually Lewis, and he changed his name to Leonard legally when he was 16. He started piano at a young age when a friend dropped off a piano at their house. He didn't actually get piano lessons. His father was not super supportive initially. They owned a wig company, if I recall correctly, and were fairly well off, but music was not going to be Leonard's path if his father had anything to say about it. So in light of that, he sort of started teaching himself how to do all of these things, and there's stories of him enlisting the neighborhood children and teaching them and giving them piano lessons and teaching them to play full operas and do little concerts of, Beethoven and all of these things that we do in conservatories nowadays. And he was doing that with his friends at, 12. In particular, he was drawn to the music of George Gershwin, Maurice Ravel, so a little bit more of that jazz influence from an early age. Actually, when Gershwin passed away, Bernstein was at a summer camp, and he was a counselor at the time. He stopped the whole lunch hour and played Gershwin piece as a memorial on the spot to announce the passing of Gershwin. So very influenced by Gershwin. We'll speak more about his influences at length later. College years, so he was clearly interested as a child, enough to where by the time he was 14, he actually had attended a Pops concert. He started meeting some conductors. His dad picked up on the fact that Lenny was quite talented, and eventually sort of acceded to Lenny's demands. And so Leonard eventually went to Harvard in 1935, which is the same year he published his first composition. And this is already where we can see some of the influence that Judaism would play in his life. It was a setting of Psalm 148. He majored in music. His thesis title was The Absorption of Race Elements into American Music, 1939. There you go. So if that title rings any, maybe raises any red flags, this was 1939. And specifically, he's talking about some of the things that I was mentioning about many cultures bring their musical styles with them when they emigrate to the United States. We, as a musical culture, have done a very wonderful job of not just being a cultural melting pot, but a musical melting pot. And so Bernstein took tremendous advantage of that in his music and brought in all of these really fun rhythms. That's where we like West Side Story, for instance, that whole that's really common in some of the Latin American musical styles. Some of the Caribbean musical influences that he brings in, rhythmically speaking. Even some of the classical music that he writes, the piece we just heard, for example, the Overture to Candide, that main melodic sweep, you can hum that and it feels very natural, and you would never know that you're actually humming a melody that's in 7/4. Right, to put that in perspective, a normal time signatures 4/4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, beautiful. Okay, we can all do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's just clunky. It's just clunky, and yet you'd never know. So he does a very masterful job of bringing in some of these more complicated, esoteric, intellectual elements into his music, but it's never at the expense of the accessibility. I know I've said that like 3 times already. I just cannot emphasize that enough. And that is, it's not no ifs, ands, or buts. That is a large part of why his music remains so popular. It has sort of a timeless sound to it. It comes from a very particular time, but it is not defined by that time. The music can exist outside of it, and that's not something, unfortunately, that all composers succeed in. Oh, that was a tangent. I'm sorry. So, majored in music. While at Harvard, he met some composers such as Mark Blitzstein and Aaron Copland, who took on mentoring roles for the young Lenny. He also met Dimitri Mitropoulos, who was a very influential Greek conductor and was part of the inspiration for him to become a conductor himself. Bernstein graduated cum laude in 1939 and then proceeded to enroll at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, arguably the most prestigious program in the country. Curtis actually has the lowest acceptance rate of any institution in the country, at least it did 10 years ago when I was applying. It's something around 4%, because it's based on a spot system. So you can apply all you want, but if no one from that, baritone studio of that particular teacher graduates in the year that you're applying, it doesn't matter how good you are, there's no spot. So that's partially why it's so exclusive in that sense. They only have so many spots. It's all full scholarships. And so it's very prestigious for him to be able to attend. While there, he studied conducting with Fritz Reiner, who was a very demanding teacher, and actually a testament to Bernstein's musicality. It is claimed that Fritz Reiner gave Bernstein the only A grade out of any student he ever taught in conducting. Only Bernstein got an A. So there you go. He also studied piano with Isabel Vengerova, orchestration with Randall Thompson, counterpoint with Richard Stohr, and score reading with Renée Longuy-Michel. I think I'm pronouncing that last one right. I actually had not heard of her before, but the others are all very, very, very big names. And even, I think Renée is too. I am not personally familiar with her. He also studied conducting in 1940 with Sergei Koussevitzky, again, very influential. If you've not heard of any of these other people, I think if you listen to them, you can certainly see where Bernstein got a lot of his inspiration from. Okay, so he graduated in 1941. His conducting debut, he moved on, he started supporting himself with some smaller jobs, teaching piano, playing piano, actually more performing, and then got a position as an assistant conductor. And in 1943, conductor Bruno Walter, again, super famous guy at the time, came down with the flu. And this is like, you know, if he's not conducting, people are just not going to go to that. Like, that's how famous he was. They're not going to be interested in this other guy, this assistant conductor. So that being said, Bernstein comes in with no rehearsal and on short notice, and he conducts this particularly challenging program, which included works by Schumann, Wagner, Strauss, and actually a couple more modern works as well that are no longer in the repertoire for good reason. His burgeoning career just exploded from there. So the papers the day after his conducting debut were awash with praise. It was like, you know, young sensation, came out of nowhere, and he just captured the hearts of the people and really took the conducting world by storm. And so, again, sort of outlining his four main roles: performance, conducting, education, and composing. So just starting with his performing career. Initially, he actually supported himself, like I said, more through his performing. He was a wonderful pianist. He would coach singers on how to, you know, be musical and still sing, which is actually really hard. And he would play for dance classes at Carnegie Hall. He had a habit of conducting at the piano, which is something that really only experienced performer conductors will do, because you have to be both in the performing mindset and in the conducting mindset. And yes, I do have an example of that we'll listen to. He also did have some definitive recordings as a performer, not as many as a conductor, but his recording of the Ravel Piano Concerto in G with the Philharmonia Orchestra is in particular considered to be one of the definitive recordings of the Ravel. You'll notice I mentioned Ravel earlier. Bernstein was one of Ravel's real champions, and not just Ravel. He was also invited by Arturo Toscanini, again, another like big name of the day, to play as the soloist in Ravel's concerto, so that became sort of one of his pieces. And he would occasionally perform as the soloist in his own compositions, an example being his Symphony No. 2, The Age of Anxiety, which is a really wonderful piano part. And as his career progressed, he did end up spending more time conducting and composing than performing, although it's not something that he ever put aside fully. So yeah, here we go. So conductor. He proceeded to debut with orchestras all over the world, including Pittsburgh, New York City Symphony, Czech Philharmonic, Tel Aviv, Boston Symphony Orchestra, and many more. He conducted world premieres of many famous composers, including the Tarangalila Symphony I mentioned earlier of Messiaen, some works of Charles Ives, John Cage, Ginastera, Berio, Shostakovich, Boulez, Ligeti, names that may bring some trauma to those that are familiar with their music. Championed works by underrepresented composers as well, such as Gustav Mahler, Carl Nielsen, Jean Sibelius, and also American composers like Aaron Copland, Bill Schumann, and David Diamond. So he really went out of his way to be a sort of not just a conductor of the established works, but really bringing in the new as well. So this first clip, and we're not going to listen to all of it because it is the full Rhapsody in Blue, but he does, as the piano soloist and as the conductor, he does the full thing from the piano. So let's just listen to the intro. Very important to get situated. we'll skip to the end. I don't want to deprive us of more Bernstein. So another example of him conducting. Now, so the previous example, now of course you can't talk about conducting and performing and composing. There's always overlap. So it's not like these were distinct areas in his life. This example of him conducting is particularly unique because, again, it's one of the things that they tell you in conducting school never to do. You know what? I'm not even going to preface this. Let's. I'm just waiting. The camera will zoom out. See, he's not conducting. Literally, it's just like a 30-second clip of him doing that. He's not using his hands. The orchestra's just going. And see, it's a Haydn symphony. You can get away with it. There's no rubato. There's no tug and pull in the rhythms. It's just da 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 ba da ba da ba da ba da ba da. It just goes. So as far as the orchestra's concerned, they're just playing. And so he's able to take the I don't know, the brain power that would go to waving his arms, and he's using his face. And yeah, he's literally just standing, and you can see in the expression exactly what he wants. Which, again, in conducting school, they say you're supposed to if you want them to be happy, then yeah, you go like this, and but you're not supposed to use your face. So just very unique, and he never let the perception of what might be too much or too over the top or too schmaltzy, to use the term, Yiddish term. He never let that hold him back, and in my opinion, that was actually one of his greatest strengths. For me, a lot of his contemporaries, in their interpretations, they feel very restrained. They have a tendency to feel very restrained. I don't find that with Bernstein's music, and I find personally that it's actually his interpretations are so engaging. You can take a piece that he conducts and play it for someone that has never heard classical music before, and even if they don't love it, it'll get their attention, maybe more than a recording by his contemporary. And I think it's because he never allowed himself to fall into the trap of false modesty, in the sense that, we can't let the music be too much because it'll be too much and people will. There's all these things that they tell us in music school about how it has to be, and it has to be just so, and you have to tie the bow and get the cherry on top and all these things. And he never really allowed himself to fall into that, but he also never ever went too far. There was always a justification, a reason behind the excess. And I think this particular recording is a wonderful and it even started in the right place. Just And they actually muted the recording, but there is immediate, thunderous applause. As soon as he hits that chord, there's multiple versions. That's actually the remastered version of this recording. So yeah, there's immediate applause. It's just, and I don't know if you notice, but there's something unique in the way that he approaches the music that not a lot of conductors do. He sort of gets lost in his own world, but he does it so convincingly and in a way that he telegraphs so clearly that as a musician, you just know. I mean, you know exactly what the man wants. And I've been fortunate in my short career to have worked with some truly exceptional conductors, some of whom were students of Bernstein. And to feel that connection is just very unique. It's not something that, as a singer, that I have felt with a lot of conductors. And it's something that always drew me to the music of Bernstein, in particular to his interpretations and his recordings, because you can always tell exactly what he wants. It's never a mystery. There's some conductors where they're throwing their arms around, and I worked with one guy, his cue, which is what you're supposed to look for to come in, he just threw that. So you don't get that with someone like Bernstein. I mean, you could see he was looking right at the people. It's a little over the top, maybe, yes. Conducting, you'd look at a recording of that in conducting school and they'd say, okay, here's what to do and here's what not to do. But it does something. It's not unsuccessful. And that's kind of what I want to get. There's a lot of criticism, and maybe justifiably so, I don't know. But there is a lot of criticism of Bernstein in his interpretations of being too much, too over the top. For me, it doesn't ever hit that too much. But I also have to remember, as we all do, music is subjective, and our own opinions they really only matter to us, as painful as that is to accept. I wish I could say, oh, this is objectively good music. But as wonderful as I think this is, there may even, some of you might not have liked that, and that's fine. But, that's always going to be the case. Anyway, so also his career as an educator. So he established a long-running relationship with the Tanglewood Institute in Massachusetts, which still runs to this day, still lots of fond memories of Leonard Bernstein there. He also, from 1958 until 1972, recorded 53 young people's concerts, which actually won multiple Emmys. And I did not know that, so that was a really, really fun little fun fact for me. So yeah, Bernstein won several Emmys for his educational work. He also co-founded no fewer than 3 music academies: the LA Philharmonic Institute, the Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival Orchestral Academy, and the Pacific Music Festival. Just the Pacific Music Festival. And that's I believe, Japanese, South Korean, Indo-Pacific region festival. He also created the Bernstein Education Through the Arts Fund in 1990. That sort of merged in 92 with the Bernstein Center after it was posthumously established. And that all has coalesced into the Leonard Bernstein Artful Learning Program that currently exists today. He also, and keep in mind this is a partial list, but he inspired many up-and-coming composers of the day, including Seiji Ozawa, Claudio Abbado, Lorraine Mazel, Marian Alsop, Michael Tilson Thomas, James DePriest. I'll skip a couple that I'm less familiar with. Joan Folletta, Maurice, I don't recognize that one. Carl St. Clair, Jaap van Sweden. I think Jaap van Sweden is actually is he currently at NY? He's with the Met, I think. So these are big names. I actually worked personally with Carl St. Clair. That was my very first performance that I ever did professionally. I was in college, and they were looking for a group of students to do the prologue from his Trouble in Tahiti, one of his operettas. And so I was part of that trio, and so I got to work with Carl St. Clair, hear some of his stories about working with Bernstein, and it was just a really phenomenal performance. I don't think I'll ever forget that one. So yeah, here's an example from his young people's concerts. I believe this is one of the earlier ones. This one was from the late 1950s.
Take another giant step toward finding out our answer to what music means. And this is a really big step. We're getting closer now to the answer, because now we're going to forget all about those pieces that try to tell stories or paint pictures. We've had enough of that. And we're going to listen to music that describes emotions, feelings, like pain, happiness, loneliness, anger, love. I guess most music is like that. And the better it is, the more it will make you feel those emotions that the composer felt when he was writing it. Tchaikovsky was a composer who always tried to do this, who always tried to have his music mean something easily recognized as emotional. Take this part of his Fourth Symphony, for instance. I guess the best way to describe that would be by saying that it has the feeling of wanting something very badly that you can't have. Did you ever feel that you wanted something more than anything else in the world, and you said so, and they said, no, you can't have it, and you said again, I want it, and again they said no, and again you said louder and more excited, I want it, and again louder, I want it, until it seemed that something would break in your head and there's nothing left to do but cry. Well, that's like this music. Listen. I want it. 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 Finally, something breaks in your head, and you cry. Now listen to the orchestra play it and see if you don't feel something like those emotions. Pretty emotional stuff, isn't it?
So I just want to draw attention to what a master class that was. So he starts from the orchestra, 2 steps, and there's just this random piano just there, and he's starting and he plays beautifully. By the way, like that's hard. That's what we call an orchestral reduction. So he's playing the entire orchestra's parts with 10 fingers, and then while he's doing that, he's lecturing. And then he just takes 2 steps right back and starts conducting an 80-piece orchestra. I mean, there I can count on maybe 2 hands the number of people in the world that can do that. It's really like to be able to do, and all of that took place in about 3 minutes. That was like a 3-minute clip. So it's just the full picture of his talent, and then to speak so eloquently to a group of children that you could see clearly at the beginning, they're kind of losing focus a little bit. But by the time he's done, he has them again. Like they're all like, oh, it's really interesting. So it's really, that's, I mean, I just love that personally. I think it's such a wonderful example of him. So also as a composer, and this is where we'll finish up, and then I'll have some, one more clip and then some time for questions. More than 40 minutes, I'm so sorry. So his influences were predominantly classical music, which you can also think of as art music or concert music, jazz, pop, Broadway, Latin, and Jewish musical sources. His diverse body of works included operetta, musical theater, ballet, instrumental music, art, songs, choral music, you name it. The Jewish influence was clearly audible in his works, including the Jeremiah Symphony, the Kaddish Symphony, things like the Chichester Psalms, Hashkivenu. He wrote a ballet operatic type work called Dybbuk, about mischievous little spirits. Some of his compositional highlights, not by any means a full list, not even remotely close to a full list. These are just sort of the big ones. A couple ballets, a few successful operettas. The most well-known would be Candide of that list. Musicals, On the Town, Peter Pan, West Side Story. He did musical scores for all of those. Huge body of instrumental music, choral music, you name it. So I'd like to end, and then we'll have about 8 minutes or so for questions. We started with Candide, with Bernstein conducting. We're going to end with Candide, with Bernstein conducting. Yeah. It speaks for itself.
And so have I, but come and be my wife, and let us try before we die to make some sense of life. We're neither pure, nor wise, nor good. We'll do the best we know. We'll build our house, we'll chop our wood, and make our garden
questions?
Any questions? Couldn't help myself. So that's the end of my. So yes, please, yeah, Barry.
So at one time, did Bernstein? I know that he conducted for the Vienna Symphony Orchestra, but wasn't he there for a long period after the war period?
No, I mean, he was, yeah, so he had a long-standing relationship with many of the European orchestras. To my knowledge, it was never long-term, like full-time contracts. It was more like he would go out there and conduct and do like festivals and educational things, but I don't recall ever like he was like the Vienna Staatsoper conductors. Like I don't think of anything like that now, but I would look into it myself and double check.
Could you tell us about his decision to change his name from Louis to Leonard?
Yeah, so his grandmother wanted him to be named Louis, and he didn't like the name, but she insisted on it, and so he was Louis Leonard Bernstein. I believe Leonard was his middle name, or something to that effect. And so when he was 16 and had the ability to legally change it, he changed it to Leonard, because that was his.
Leonard was already there. It wasn't that he just randomly picked Leonard.
I think it was his middle name, and his grandmother had insisted that he be called Louis. It was like her dying wish or something like that. So they honored her wish, and then when he turned 16, he decided he wanted Leonard as his first name. Oh yes, I'm so sorry. Yeah. So for those on Zoom, the first question was about whether he had any long-term postings in Europe. The second question was about whether or not. Yes, sorry. Why he changed his name? Thank you. Yeah. Why he changed his name? Huh?
So I want to ask a kind of a technical conducting question about the Mahler's second.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
At some point in the horns turn
Yes.
their bells towards the
Correct.
center.
Correct.
I've never seen that.
Yes, and you won't. You won't see that often.
Done in any context. My question is, do you think that's Bernstein's innovation?
No, that is marked in the score. So Gustav Mahler actually, at several points in his second and eighth symphonies, maybe the fifth and sixth as well. I'm not as familiar with the fifth and sixth, but at several points in the second and eighth symphony, he actually instructs the French horn players, which French horn, by the way, there's more of them than other brass players because the timbre of the instrument is generally a softer, more muted color, whereas a trumpet or a trombone tends to be a little bit more in your face. So a normal symphony orchestra will have about 2 trumpets, maybe 2 or 3 trombones, and typically 4 French horns. So Mahler already, he'll double that. So he'll typically have 8 French horns. And since he loves the timbre of the French horn, but it's very soft, he was concerned that at climactic moments, their melody wouldn't cut through the orchestra because the way they orient the bell, I'm not going to give a percentage because I would be making it up, but a large percentage of that sound actually is diffused, and it does not go to the audience. Because when they're playing, normally the mouthpiece is here and the bell is actually here, so the sound is being projected backwards. So they actually do that in order to help the projection and to make sure that the melody is audible over the texture. The texture of the music, for Mahler, we would say it's very thick. It's a very thick texture. It's difficult to pick out 1 or 2 parts because they're all there and they're all in very close voice to each other, which is much harder to pick out. If it was like 1 note down here and 1 note way up here, that's a lot easier for our brains to parse. So it's a very thick texture. In order for the poor little French horns to cut through, it's actually an acoustical reasoning for that. That's a great question, though, because it's not something that you see in other works. It's unique to Mahler. It's actually a stage direction that he writes in. So every French horn part will say, in German or a translation thereof, to turn the bell of the instrument towards the audience, and some will even stand. So randomly, all of a sudden, 8 French horn players will point their instruments toward the audience and stand up. Like, whoa.
This may seem like an odd question, but there's been a lot of discussion at OU this semester about language requirements. I couldn't help but notice that Bernstein was singing along in German.
Yes.
I don't remember which piece, but it was
the Mahler.
clear that you knew the words.
The Mahler, yes.
Mahler, thank you. And so I'm just wondering, do you know anything about where Bernstein learned some German?
Yes.
Italian?
So it's a requirement. The question, sorry, I keep forgetting about Zoom. So the previous question was about why the French horns point their bells up during that Mahler excerpt that I showed. And this question is, I'm so sorry, I've lost it again.
Just where did he clearly knows?
Yeah. So where does he get these language skills from? Thank you. I'm a little scatterbrained this morning. So yeah, where does he get the language skills from? That's actually a requirement in most conservatory settings. Whereas in a college setting, the typical requirement might be a couple of years of Spanish or something. Most musicians will take Italian, German, and or French as their language of study. Because so many composers came from those countries, were native speakers of those languages, wrote songs in those languages, and not all conductors go out of their way to be as well-versed as Bernstein and many of his contemporaries were, but that is generally more of a requirement than anything else, actually. Because, again, so much of this music is by these other composers of these different countries, and so when you see presto, con moto, you have to know what that means. Or now, of course, I'm blanking on all my German musical notations, but langsam, right? You have to know. So you see langsam. Well, what's that? Well, oh, slowly. Okay, so now I know that the piece is slow. How else am I going to know that? So there's a little bit of language requirement that comes into it because of that. Yes, no problem. We can also have a few minutes afterwards if people have other questions.
I just wanted to say this. I didn't realize that Bernstein had written that thesis on race music.
Mm-hmm.
It was very striking to me because ask anyone this, who in 1957 or 8, when West Side Story was first performed, ever wrote about Puerto Ricans?
Mm-hmm.
Who wrote about gang life in New York City? Who wrote
Right.
about assimilation?
Right.
This battle between the Polish group and the Puerto Rican group or the new arrivals.
And
who writes about that? And
absolutely.
His use of all the Latin motifs and all that music, it's incredible.
And not only that, he was a champion, not just of composers, but of performers. And so he would make every effort to get women performers of color, just people that otherwise may not have been afforded opportunities in that day and age. And he made a point of bringing them in. Andre Watts actually is a wonderful example, a pianist that really got his start because of Bernstein and went on to have an immensely successful career as a performing pianist. So.
I think maybe we'll end the formal part, but if Elliott.
Sure, yeah, I can stick around for a couple minutes. And, yeah.
Please join me. This was such.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Elliott,
Very nice.
Elliott, real quick.
Thank
Do you
you.
know what performance of Candide was in the last clip?
So that was a performance of Candide. That was from 1989. It was like one of the very final performances. If they're interested in looking it up on YouTube, anything that you type like Candide Leonard Bernstein, it is basically the first thing that pops up. And it, I think, has more information on there, but it's oh my God, I'm forgetting his name. Jerome Hadley is the tenor, and I can't remember the soprano, but it's one of his final concerts, actually.
All right.
right, thank you.
So